For years, pork has gotten a bad rap as an unhealthy meat. But is it really? Hello, this is Hatu, Assistant Editor of Asian Pork Magazine. Today, Isa Q. Tan speaks with Darryl D'Souza about the healthiness of pork, the misconceptions about it, and how producers can correct them and promote pork consumption.
Hi, Daryl. Hello, and thank you for joining me today for this podcast.
Hello, Isa, and yeah, thanks for the invite and happy to be here.
Pork remains the meat of choice globally, and certainly in many Southeast Asian and East Asian countries, it is the preferred meat. Despite that, though, people still perceive it as less healthy. So I wanted to talk to you about that and ask you, is pork meat really healthy? And now that there's all this demand for healthier food and the coming of alternative proteins, what can pork producers do so they can retain their hold in the market? But before we get to the questions, can I ask you to please say a little something about yourself, introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. So I'm the Executive General Manager for Technical Services with the Sunpork Group. So the Sunpork Group is the largest pork or pig producer in Australia. We've got something like 52,000 sows, and we're vertically integrated from genetics through to processing, and we also have our own value add facilities. So my role is predominantly around managing our R&D programs, technical training that we do, our quality systems, and I also look after our genetics business.
Okay. Let me get started and ask you, how healthy is pork meat? And what are the good and what are the bad about pork meat?
Yeah, so pork is very healthy, and if you look at, there's a lot of work that's been done that's used pork as part of a healthy diet. So pork, as we know, contains a lot of micronutrients, essential micronutrients, things like protein, thiamine, niacin, vitamin Bs that are extremely important for human growth and development, but also healthy aging. And if you look at some of the research looking at healthiness of pork, there's pork in diets that facilitates maintaining muscle mass, particularly in the elderly. Fresh pork in a diet can be used, and we've looked at a whole range of consumption levels, and we see very little to no shift in some of the risk indicators for cardiovascular disease and also things like diabetes and those types of metabolic diseases. We've also looked at levels of obesity are increasing. There's research done where they've looked at pork as a high protein diet coupled with exercise, and it resulted in significant shifts in body weight and also body fat content in obese patients. And so there's a lot of work that shows pork is a healthy meat. Unfortunately, pork is tainted in many ways by a consumer perception that it is a fatty meat, and that gives it this sort of bad perception, if you like, or unhealthy perception. I personally think there is nothing bad with pork. Pork it's delicious, it's nutritious, but like a lot of things, Isa, everything in moderation. If you have too much of a good thing, it could potentially become detrimental to you. And so from this point of view, moderation is the key. You can eat, on certain occasions, have pork cuts or offal, for example, that, yes, they may have a little bit more fat and that's flavor and all of those things, but they're equally leaner cuts of pork that are healthy for you. Yeah, and so I think that's my take. There's a lot of good things about it, but I don't necessarily see anything bad about pork.
Okay, so So it's the fat that actually led to that less healthy perception. So how can producers counter this perception? What do you think they can do?
Just go back to the issue of fat and some of the negative perceptions around pork. I mean, there's also risk or perceptions, if you like, that get perpetuated with studies that show, pork or red meat consumption is linked with higher risks for cardiovascular disease and, dare I say it, certain cancers. Those things coupled with also there's a negative connotation around processed meats, which pork plays a significant role. That also these studies, which are relationship based as opposed to finding cause and effect, if you like. But if you look at some of these risk factors, we believe certainly there's a lot of confounding factors when they are in those myths. So coming back to producers taking charge of the narrative, I think too often pork industries worldwide, and it's not only in Asia or Australia, we don't tell our story enough. There are a lot of good things about pork, and we certainly don't talk about it. We just sort of like to keep our head down and supply these products into various retail outlets. Yes, there may be some advertising and things like that. And when you talk to consumers, but all these positive effects that pork has outside of, it can be nutritious, tasty, and can be used in various occasions. It's versatile, all of those things. We just don't tell the consumer. The other thing, talking about how healthy pork is just one attribute. From an environmental point of view, it has a low greenhouse gas emission compared to other meats. If you look at production systems now, we're bridging the gap to poultry in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We're not that far. And so, again, these stories need to be told. And unfortunately, we don't do enough of this.
Do you think many of the industry people are seeing this need now or not yet? Or are they still complacent enough?
It takes a while for these stories to build and get received by consumers and start changing their perceptions. We need to tell our stories to different groups, all of them consumers. So we need to have some education around where our food comes in schools. Our pork industry is being part of the curriculum, for example, in healthy eating and nutrition and all of that. We need to start now, and we probably need to start quite a few years ago, because it takes time for that to filter through all the different consumer groups and be aware. The other thing is we have health professionals, nutritionists, etc. I wonder how many nutritionists know how healthy pork is. There's so many different things pork can be part of, where it can be part of a healthy meal.
Okay, so there really needs to be more education about pork.
Yeah, education. You've got to be careful with education, because sometimes it can come across as a little bit arrogant and telling people, etc. So you tell a story in terms of this is how we look after our animals. This is what, some of the attributes are of. So yes, you're educating them, but it's telling a story. So there's an interest factor over there. Okay, yeah, Isa, you're telling me about the pork industry. I actually think that's pretty interesting. Whereas you should do this and you should do that and you should eat this and you should eat that. People start turning off.
All right. Well, a lot has been said about poultry overtaking pork as the preferred meat, not just in Asia, but around the world. Do you think there's any merit to this, and why?
So we need to look at why consumers potentially are attracted to poultry. There's a number of factors, things like, low price, some product consistency, and also versatility. And you've got this whole protein fat ratio, which pork is slightly fattier than poultry. However, like I said before, there are lean cuts that you can use as a healthy and nutritious diet. Insofar as where poultry consumption is currently, so certainly if we look at in Asia and Southeast Asia and even China, it's a fair gap between pork and poultry. In Australia, it's the reverse. Poultry is way up over there, and pork is bridging the gap. The red meat like beef and things like that, they've started declining, but their markets are mainly export. All the projections that I've looked at tells us, yes, there is a lot of bridging this gap to pork in Asia, but none of those projections are actually saying over the next 10 years we're likely to see poultry overtake pork. I think where we see these little glitches is you look at ASF, for example. So you look at China. There was, because of supply issues, and yes, there was a lot of imported pork coming in, but there was still this gap in consumption of meat. And poultry did substitute pork in that instance. So we did see this big jump in places like China for poultry production. However, if you extrapolate that, and as I said, if you look at some of these forecasts, none of them actually show significant shifts. Yes, there might be slight increases in different countries, but that gap's pretty big. And yes, we'll see a few little bumps and things like that. But as we come out of ASF, fingers crossed, those supply and demand will continue in the favor of pork, I believe anyway.
So some of the people I've talked to have actually said that, yeah, it's really more just because the supply has been down. So once you've got that back to normal, then people, at least here in Asia and in Southeast Asia, will go back to eating.
I tend to agree with that. There are a small group of consumers that get used to poultry and their recipe repertoire and things like that. Once they substitute, people particularly who like, following very similar patterns in terms of recipes and things like that. And they'll quite happily bounce around between pork and poultry because they know they're comfortable in both. So you'll get a small percentage of consumers that will flip between pork and poultry. But I think, as you say, once supplies come back on, people will continue. And the projections, and these are all post-COVID and later projections, are basically saying if you look at from now to 2030, we're not seeing those gaps get bridged.
Okay. What about alternative protein products, which are, again, being marketed as healthier and better options than conventional meats? Is that something that pork producers should worry about?
Well, if you believe the marketing, we should be very worried. But unfortunately, that narrative, and you're right, they say it's healthier for you, it's better for the environment, it's ethically better to eat, and they're gaining a lot of publicity. And essentially what they're telling the consumer is, if you want to be healthy, if you want to save the planet, and if you want to be less cruel to your animal, eat plants. So they've got the story going, which is resonating. The big difference, though, I think in this instance, we are not seeing big shifts in consumption. Now, you look at all their projections, and there are some very bold projections in terms of plant-based. You look at some of those projections 3 years ago, and you look at what they're doing currently, and very few of them even come close to realizing their predictions in terms of consumption. So I have my doubts that plant-based will, in fact, match their projections of consumption. They will continue to be a disruptor in the marketplace, and they will be a small proportion of consumer. And we have to bear in mind, these plant-based meats aren't necessarily targeting vegans, or they're targeting meat eaters. They're not necessarily seeking for these meat eaters to become vegetarian or become vegans. They're basically saying all you need to do is substitute a couple of meals a week. The thing that I think their price points on their products at the moment are extremely high. And things are going to get more expensive as we come out of COVID and things like that. So I think their price points will limit what they can gain in terms of their demand and meeting some of those consumption targets. I also think, and this is, again, it's not only the pork industry, but the meat industry. Yes, there's been a lot of chatter around some of their claims, if you like. But you look at some of their products that they claim are healthy, at the end of the day, they're so highly processed. And you look at things like salt content, their salt content is higher than, what you would get from a hamburger. And so well above recommended intakes and things like that. So I struggle to really see people making this as part of, yes, there'll be a small proportion of consumers. So there'll be a little disruption in the marketplace. But as far as meat consumption displacement, certainly for pork, I can't see it happening.
Okay. So there's, at least for now, nothing to worry about.
Correct.
Okay. Well, again, going back to that thought of pork being less healthy and us wanting to bring out the message that it is actually a healthy meat, are there ways that producers actually make pork healthier?
Yeah, look, I think if you look back at certainly about 5 years ago, everybody was talking about functional foods. And so this is fortification and nutritional enhancement of functional properties of pork, and things like adding selenium, for example, which helped. You have foods that are fortified with omegas, again, healthy for you for a range of different reasons. You can always do that. Mm-hmm. But I still think there is so much good in pork from a health point of view. We really don't need to. Lean pork, for example, yes, it can still taste nice and still taste delicious, and it's nutritious for you. Again, it comes back to this messaging around, there are certain things you can get from meat, but in pork in particular, where it is very healthy for you. And so, yes, you can fortify pork. It's quite easy to fortify pork. But do I really feel that should be done? Probably not.
Okay. Well, I have just one more question before I end. And that's one of the reasons why some consumers don't like very lean meat is because they tend to be less tender and less flavorful than the meat that has fat. And so there's this demand for some marbling in pork. And they say that one is more tender, more juicy, and it's more delicious. Is that true? And should that be where pork producers should go?
Yeah, look, I mean, marbling's an interesting one. I mean, you've got the beef industry that looks at marbling, etc., and they certainly can show marbling improves sensory quality. In pork, things like ultimate pH, and we have data that shows if you get your ultimate pH right, some of the impacts on sensory quality are more than you would get with marbling. Consumers have this view around marbling and its impact on sensory quality. And it's almost like a visual stimulus, if you like. If I see marbling, then I automatically think it's going to be really delicious. And people shop with their eyes as well. So we can't ignore that. And so there are ways that producers can, play around nutritionally and pull back protein to energy ratios in diets to get more marbling in. And you can do it at different stages so you don't get blowouts in subcutaneous fat and things like that. So yeah, you could potentially do those sort of things.
Okay. Well, I think you and I had a good discussion about pork, and I hope to be able to help you in promoting the healthiness of pork.
Excellent. Love it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Darryl, for joining me today.
As Dr. D'Souza pointed out, pork has many benefits, and despite threats of pork consumption being overtaken by poultry and alternative proteins in Asia, pork is likely to keep its hold as the most consumed meat in the region. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Please tune into our future podcast. For more on Asia's animal protein industry, visit www.asian-agribase.com.